We're ready to go? Okay, let's get started.
Sorry, excuse me.
Yes.
Before we get started, there's menus in your folder for next week. Please leave them with Danielle for me, please.
Great.
Okay.
Put your names on them?
Yes.
Thank you, Charmaine. Okay. Okay. Good morning. I'm Nestor Davidson, Chair of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board, and I'd like to welcome you to this meeting of the board. This is the third meeting in a series of public meetings and hearings to determine lease adjustments for rent-stabilized housing units in New York City, with leases commencing or being renewed on or after October 1st, 2024, and on or before September 30th, 2025. I will now take roll call. Please respond if present. Doug Apple.
Present.
Anissis Aquino. Christina DeRose.
Present.
Rob Ehrlich.
Present.
Arpit Gupta. Alex Schwartz.
Present.
Christina Smith. Odon Soltran.
Present.
Nestor Davidson, I'm present. Let the record show that we have a quorum. The next planned meeting of this board will be here at the Landmarks Preservation Commission Conference Room next Thursday on April 25th, starting at 9:30 a.m. The board will hear testimony from speakers who have been invited by the tenant and owner members of the board. Speakers representing owners will be heard from 9:45 a.m. to 12:15 p.m., and speakers representing tenants from 1 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. To our RGB tenant and owner members, please get a list of presenters to Andrew by April 23rd. The public can also live stream this upcoming meeting via YouTube at youtube.com/Rent Guidelines Board, all one word. The preliminary vote for rent-stabilized lease adjustments will be held on Tuesday, April 30th. This in-person meeting will start at 7 p.m. and will be held at the LaGuardia Performing Arts Center at LaGuardia Community College in Long Island City, Queens. If you plan to attend, please use the entrance on Van Dam Street at the intersection of 47th Avenue. This meeting will also be live streamed via YouTube. Information regarding this meeting will be posted on our website, nyc.gov/RGB in our meetings section. If you are interested in receiving email updates about upcoming RGB meetings and hearings, please go to our homepage and click on the RGB email updates under quick links. Today, staff will present the 2024 Price Index of Operating Costs and the 2024 Mortgage Survey Report. Copies of these reports are in your meeting folder. There are copies of these reports here today, and they will be made available on our website after the meeting. Just click Research on our homepage to download these reports. After the staff report presentations and our board discussion, we'll hear from our guest speaker, Deputy Commissioner Woody Pascal from New York State Homes and Community Renewal. And a friendly reminder to members of the board that the annual filing of our Conflicts of Interest Board financial disclosure reports, the filing period is open and will end on May 3rd. Please file before the deadline. I will now introduce, unless folks have any questions or comments.
So, just a very quick question. When can folks expect the public hearing schedule to be finalized?
So we are still working on one venue. We have 3 of the 4. So we have Manhattan, Queens, and the Bronx, Hostos, Jamaica Performing Arts Center, and we're actually going to go to the Ethical Cultural Society in Midtown. It's like at 65th, 66th. I can get the exact address. But the dates may shift because we're still trying to lock down our Brooklyn venue. So we're hoping, we're very close, but we're not at the final dates yet.
So, just to be clear though, the Midtown location is for which hearing?
For the Manhattan hearing.
Okay, and so there's just one scheduled Manhattan hearing
Exactly.
currently? I guess this is a question for Andrew. I realize you're a little busy over there, Andrew. But
Go ahead.
Historically, right, there had been an uptown and a downtown Manhattan hearing, right? Prior to COVID. It was my understanding, at least.
Oh boy, you're going to test my memory. So there was a time we had 2 hearings, but we started just having an uptown hearing at one point. So the few years prior to COVID, it was just uptown. Does that sound right? Okay, thank you. We just had the one. So we just went to the one in Manhattan.
And prior to, I guess, is the question.
Prior to that,
2018, 2017.
we had two. And prior to that, we had one. So there was a period of it, we had 17 and 18, we had two. And then 2019, we just had the one. And so, yeah.
I just want to note on the
And
record that
before that, I mean, there was, if you historically go back, we used to have two hearings for a very long time, all in Manhattan. So then, in the, I don't know, 2004, 2005, we started having outer borough hearings. So, and we would have a Manhattan hearing and an outer borough hearing. And we would rotate that outer borough every year. And then it switched that we're having 4 hearings in each. So we'd have, I think that came around in 2013, 2014, we started having 4 hearings. And then that year it was 2 hearings in Manhattan. So historically, for many years we had 2. So we're now up to 4 and 1 in each borough was the plan for this year, but so that's where it stands.
So I completely understand that the logistics are difficult, finding space is difficult. I just want to be on the record as saying I do believe that we should have an uptown and a downtown Manhattan hearing for, I think, what should be obvious reasons in terms of, the tenants living in core Manhattan, what we consider core Manhattan, as well as uptown. There's sometimes a narrative that we wind up hearing about the difference of conditions and what they're experiencing, and I think that it's important to hear from all the tenants or different folks living throughout the borough of Manhattan. And as you may imagine, right, it's not necessarily convenient or easy for folks that live all the way downtown in the Lower East Side and Chinatown, et cetera, living in this housing, always to make it to one central location or a location uptown. And so I just want to put on the record that it's our position that there should be 2 Manhattan hearings.
Thank you, Don.
Did I miss, is there still also going to be a remote option, or are we just doing in-person?
We're just doing in-person this year. Any other questions? Great, thank you. Let me now introduce Andrew McLaughlin, our Executive Director, who will be presenting the 2024 Price Index of Operating Costs Report.
Good morning. I said good morning. I'm sorry. Okay, here we go. The New York City Rent Guidelines Board Price Index of Operating Costs gathers prices for a market basket of goods and services used in the operation and maintenance of buildings that contain rent-stabilized units in New York City, and uses these prices to estimate cost price changes from one year to the next. Changes in the overall PIOC result from changes in the prices of individual goods and services, each weighted by its relative importance as percentage of the total operating and maintenance expenditures. This is the same approach used by the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, and other similar indices, but the PIOC specifically analyzes the goods and services typically purchased by owners of buildings containing rent-stabilized units. Separate indices are calculated for rent-stabilized apartments, hotels, and lofts. So here is an overview in the changes in the apartment PIOC, which we will go into detail shortly. Notably, taxes, which account for nearly 30% of the price index, increased 3.2%. The largest proportional increase was seen in insurance, 21.7%. More moderate increases were seen in administrative cost, 4.6%, labor costs, 4.3%, maintenance, 3.5%, and utilities, 1.3%, while fuel costs fell 7.1%. These changes in costs resulted in an overall increase of 3.9%. By comparison, the CPI increased 3.3% over the same time period. So the PIOC is comprised of weights and cost weights and price relatives. So in the PIAC, we identify prices for various items that are representative of the operating costs for apartment buildings in the city. The importance of each of these items is then calculated, in calculating the PIOC is its weight. This should be based on how much owners have spent in the past for the category of expenses. The change in price or cost is referred to as a price relative. Before we take a more in-depth look at the price index component changes, it's important to note that the data collected for the PIOC is gathered from 4 sources: government agencies, vendors and contractors, unions and utility companies, and owners of rent-stabilized buildings. Government agencies account for about 36% of the data used in the price index. Vendors and contractors supply 29% of the data. Unions and utilities companies supply 15% of the data. And unlike the data reported in the RGB income and expense study, which is 100% owner-reported data, only 20% of the data used for the price index is gathered from owners of rent-stabilized buildings. Now I'll outline the change in the cost for the 7 components that make up the price index, starting with the tax component. The real estate tax component of the price index is the largest component and in fact represents about 30% of owners' costs. This year, taxes increased 3.2%, driven largely by a rise in the Class 2 tax rate. This slide outlines the actual changes in assessments and exemptions by borough in tax year fiscal 2024, as well as the total change in taxes. Assessed valuations of properties containing rent-stabilized apartments rose by 0.4% citywide in the current tax year, a smaller increase than last year's rise of 5.9%. Assessments rose in 4 of the 5 boroughs, with Brooklyn witnessing the largest rise at 3.2%, followed by Queens at 2.8%, the Bronx at 1.5%, and Staten Island at 0.9%. Buildings in Manhattan drive much of the change in assessed value citywide. This was true in the current tax year, where 56.3% of the total assessed value was attributed to this borough. Assessed values declined by 1.1% in Manhattan, which dampened the overall rise in assessments to 0.4% citywide. In the current tax year, 1.8% fewer buildings benefited from tax exemptions, and the value of the average tax exemption decreased by 1%. The net impact of the decrease in the number of buildings receiving exemptions, as well as a decrease in the average exemption value, was a decrease in the value of exemptions of 2.8%. This slide outlines the impact that the assessments, the tax rate, exemptions, and abatements have on the total tax rate change. As noted on the last slide, this year taxes increased 3.2%, driven largely by the rise in Class 2 tax rate. While assessments rose 0.4% in FY 2024, the increase in assessments was responsible for about 0.6% rise in the tax component, a smaller impact than the previous year when assessments were responsible for 7.8% of the rise in the tax component. The large majority of the buildings that contain rent-stabilized units are in tax Class 2. There was an increase in the Class 2 tax rate of 1.9% from the previous tax year to the current tax year, rising in each of the 5 boroughs. In fiscal year 2024, the increase in the tax rate was responsible for a 2% rise in the tax component, a larger impact than the previous year, when the tax rate was responsible for just 0.3% of the rise in the tax component. The increase in the value of abatements resulted in a 0.1% decrease in the tax component, and the decrease in both the number and value of exemptions caused a 0.7% increase in the tax component. As you can see on this graph, you can disaggregate the taxes into several components. The black line on the chart represents the change in taxes from one year to the next. This year, the change was 3.2%. The change can be broken down into the impact in assessments, which is the orange bar, and the impact of exemptions, abatements, and changes in the tax rate, which are grouped together in the maroon bar. The change in taxes was primarily due to a rise in the tax rate in the current tax year of 1.9%. The rise in assessments is also lower than in the previous year, resulting in an overall rise in taxes of 3.2%. It is interesting to note that since 2006, the increase in real estate taxes have more often than not been driven by the change in assessments. However, this was not the case this year. The next component we'll take a look at is labor costs, which rose 4.3%. The price index measure of labor costs includes union and non-union salaries and benefits, in addition to Social Security and unemployment insurance. The cost of non-unionized labor makes up more than 57% of the labor cost component. The entire labor cost component comprises 12.7% of the overall price index. Wages comprise nearly 80% of the labor cost component. Non-union pay increased by 5.2%, while unionized wages also rose, rising by a combined 2.9%. Health and welfare benefits, which comprises 13.9% of the labor cost component, increased 2.3%. An increase in the unemployment insurance of 9.9% had minimal impact since it accounts for only 1.1% of this component's weight. Our next component is fuel. The fuel component comprises 8.4% of this year's price index. The change in cost measured in this component considers both the change in weather and the change in prices for heating multifamily buildings with fuel oil, natural gas, and steam. This is the fuel component. This year, the fuel component decreased 7.1%. Natural gas costs, which account for 69.7% of the overall cost in this component, decreased by 9.3%. The cost of heating buildings by the fuel oil makes up 29.9% of this component and decreased by 2.1%. Steam costs decreased by 3.6%, but these costs account for only 0.4% of the fuel component. The utilities component consists of costs paid by owners for non-heating natural gas and electricity costs, as well as water and sewer charges, and it comprises 10.1% of this year's PIOC. This year, utilities increased 1.3%. Non-heating electricity costs, which account for 1/3 of the weight in this component, decreased by 3.7%, while non-heating gas costs, which account for less than 2% of the utilities component, decreased 18.9%. The growth in this component was driven by a 4.4% increase in the water and sewer rate. This item accounts for 65% of the utilities component. Administrative costs rose 4.6%. This component includes services performed by contractors, such as painters and plumbers, hardware and cleaning items, and appliances that need periodic replacement, such as refrigerators and stoves. This component accounts for 18.7% of this year's price index. This year, maintenance increased 3.5%. Of the 29 expense items combined in this component, just 4 items account for the half of its expenditure weight: repainting, plumbing for faucet and plumbing for stoppage, and electrician services. This year, painter rates rose 7%, combined plumbing rates increased 5.3%, and electrician services were flat, neither increasing nor decreasing. Other price relatives of note were boiler repairs, up 3%, floor maintenance, down 0.1%, and roof repair, which was up 9%. These relatives combine 6 different expense items, and they account for 21% of this component. Next up is the administrative cost component, which rose 4.6% and comprises 3.5% of the price index. Fees paid to management companies, accountants, and attorneys make up 86% of the administrative cost component. Much of the increase in the administrative cost component can be attributed to a rise in attorney fees, which rose 7.6%, and accounting and fees of 9.2%. These two items account for over 42% of administrative costs component. Communications, which accounts for about 4.5% of this component, increased 2.1%. Management fees increased for the first time in 4 years, rising by 3.2%. These fees comprise 43.6% of this component. The largest increase in this year's price index was in the insurance cost component, rising by 21.7% compared to last year's increase of 12.9%. Insurance costs account for 7.2% of the price index. Changes in insurance costs for owners varied by the amount of the policy. Prices that cost more than $11,579, which represent half of all insurance quotes, saw an increase in cost of 22.3% upon renewal. Meanwhile, buildings with policies that cost $11,579 or less saw an increase of 16.6%. We'll now move on to the other indices that are calculated in this report based on building type. In addition to the price index for all buildings that contain rent-stabilized apartments, the PIOC includes separate indices for gas-heated and oil-heated buildings. This year, the gas-heated index rose by 3.8%, slightly less than the 3.9% rise in oil-heated index. Not only does this report include indices based on the type of heat used in a building, but indices based on the building age are also calculated based on whether a building was built before 1974, which we call pre-1974, and for buildings constructed in 1974 or later, which we refer to as post-1973. This year, the pre-1974 index rose by 3.6%, less than that of the post-73 index of 5.3%. The primary difference between these two indices is the disparity in the taxes component for each index. Taxes rose in the pre-74 index by 2.4% compared to the 10.3% rise in the post-73 index. In addition to the apartment indices, the 2024 PIOC report also includes indices for hotels, lofts, the core PIOC, and projected all rent-stabilized apartment index for 2025. The price index for all hotels increased 3.3%. There were increases in 5 of the 7 hotel PIOC components. The insurance component had the highest proportional increase, rising 21.7%, but accounts for just 7.2% of the index. More moderate increases were seen in labor, 4.2%, taxes, 3.7%, administration costs, 3.5%, maintenance, 1.8%. In contrast, fuel declined by 4.1% and utilities declined by 0.4%. The hotel price index includes separate indices for each of the 3 categories of hotels that contain rent-stabilized units, and a general index for all hotels that includes all 3. The 3 categories of hotel are traditional hotels, which are Class A multiple dwellings that have amenities such as a front desk, maid, or linen services. Rooming houses, Class B multiple dwellings other than a hotel with 30 or fewer sleeping rooms. And 3, single-room occupancy hotels, Class A multiple dwellings, which are either used in whole or in part for single-room occupancy or as a furnished room house. Among the different categories of hotels, the index for traditional hotels increased by 3.9%, rooming houses 2.5%, and SROs by 3.2%. The increase in the loft PIOC this year was 8.6%. Insurance costs saw the highest proportional increase, rising 21.7, followed by administrative costs legal, which rose by 7.6%. The remaining 6 components of all rose by lesser proportions, including labor costs, which rose 4.2%, administrative costs other 3.9, maintenance 3.4, taxes 3.2, utilities 3%, and fuel 0.8%. Note that historically, administrative costs in the loft index has been split into 2 components: administrative costs legal and administrative costs other. Therefore, the loft PIOC has 8 components. The core PIOC rose 4.9% in 2024. This index measures long-term trends by factoring out shifts in fuel costs for heating buildings that contain rent-stabilized apartments in New York City. The rise in the 2024 core PIOC was 1 percentage points higher than this year's apartment index, 3.9%. This year's core PIOC rose at a faster pace than the overall PIOC because fuel costs, which were not used to calculate the core, decreased 7.1%. Section 26.510 of the Rent Stabilization Law requires the board to consider prevailing and projected operating and maintenance costs for buildings containing rent-stabilized apartments. Projections for components of the PIOC are calculated to provide the RGB with an estimate of how much costs are expected to rise in the year following our current price index. The table on this slide shows projected changes in PIOC components for 2025. Overall, the PIOC is expected to grow by 4.4% from 2024 to 2025. Costs are predicted to rise in each component except fuel, with the largest growth, 15.1%, projected to be in insurance costs. Other projected increases include maintenance, 7.3%, administrative costs, 4.8%, labor costs 3.8%, and utilities 2.4%. Taxes, the component that carries the most weight in the index, is projected to increase by 3.6%, while fuel is projected to decrease by 6%. The core PIC is projected to rise 5.4%, 1 percentage points higher than the overall PIOC for rent-stabilized apartments. So now we'll go on to the commensurate rent adjustment. Commensurate rent adjustments are a series of formulas which combine various data concerning operating costs, revenues, and inflation into a single measure that determines how much rents would have to change for the net operating income, or NOI, the amount of income remaining after operating and maintenance expenses are paid, of rent-stable apartments to remain constant. The commensurate formulas provide a set of illustrative 1- and 2-year renewal rent adjustments that would hypothetically compensate owners for the change in prices measured by the price index, while keeping NOI constant. For example, if NOI was $40 and the income was $100, how much would rents have to change to keep that NOI at $40 in absolute fixed dollars? In its simplest form, a commensurate rent adjustment is the amount of rent change needed to maintain NOI for rent-stabilized apartments at a constant level from year to year. In other words, the commensurate provides a set of illustrative 1- and 2-year renewal and vacant lease adjustments or guidelines that will compensate owners for the change in prices measured by the PIOC and keep that net operating income constant. Note that the commensurate adjustments presented on the next slide do not constitute staff or board recommendations for guideline adjustments. The various data points presented in the 2024 PIOC and other Rent Guidelines Board annual research reports, such as the Income and Expense Study or the Income and Affordability Study, supplemental data sources, in addition to public testimony, can all be considered to determine appropriate rent adjustments. The first commencement method is called the net revenue approach, designed to consider the change in the PIOC and revenue received by owners based on an estimate of tenants who sign either 1 or 2 year lease renewals. Under the net revenue formula, a guideline that would preserve NOI in the face of this year's 3.9% increase in the PIOC is 2.5% for a 1 year lease and 4.75% for a 2 year lease. The second commensurate formula, the CPI adjusted NOI formula, considers the change in the price index, the mix of lease terms, and the effect of inflation on NOI. A guideline that would preserve NOI in the face of the 3.3% increase in the consumer price index and the 3.9% increase in the price index is 4% for a 1 year lease and 7% for a 2 year lease. Please note that in change from prior years, staff is calculating a single formula for both the net revenue and CPI adjusted NOI commensurates, which assumes that after a vacancy, owners will be able to collect the applicable RGB guidelines for renewal leases and are authorized under current New York State law. Third commensurate method, the traditional commensurate adjustment, is a formula that has been in use since the inception of the Rent Guidelines Board, and is the only method that relies on both the current PIOC change as well as the PIOC projection for the following year. Note that the commensurate does not account for the mix of lease terms or the effect of inflation on NOI. The traditional commensurate yields 2.5% for a 1 year lease and 4% for a 2 year lease. This reflects the increases in operating costs of 3.9% found in the 2024 PIOC and the projection of 4.4% for next year's increase. To sum up, the price index of operating costs for rent-stabilized apartments rose 3.9%. The growth in the CPI, which measures inflation in a wide range of consumer goods and services, was lower than the PIOC, rising 3.3% during the same time period. Overall costs in natural gas heated buildings increased 3.9%, while overall costs in fuel oil heated buildings increased 3.9%. The PIOC for pre-74 buildings rose 3.6%, and post-73 buildings rose 5.3%. The core PIOC rose by 4.9% this year. The PIOC for buildings that contain rent-stabilized apartment is projected to increase 4.4% next year. And that is the end.
Thank you, Andrew. Do you mind turning that off? Where were you last Thursday? All right, let me open up for questions from the board.
Just a reminder for the members, please turn on your mics and speak directly into them, because otherwise you won't be picked up on the...
Thank you. Christina, do you want to begin?
Yeah, I just had a question about the commensurates and the net revenue versus the CPI adjusted.
Okay.
So I understand in both the sort of what the formula is solving for is holding NOI constant. And in the CPI adjusted, it's holding NOI constant, but adding CPI to that NOI? Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maintaining the, inflation adjusted
Right,
dollar.
so in your $40 NOI example, in the net revenue, it's just keeping it at the NOI at 40, whereas in the CPI adjusted, if inflation adds $1 to that, it's making
Yeah, in
it
real, right.
41. You're
$24.
solving for 41.
Yep.
Okay, just wanted to understand that. Thank you.
Thank you. Don?
Unsurprisingly, I'm going to have a lot of questions and comments. I'll start with one. Since we're talking about the projections, which I have something to say about, as I normally do, I'm just curious. If you look at the projections for the PIOC, the projections and then the actual PIOC, how many years is the projection lower or wrong since as long as we've been doing the projection?
Right. We're always right. What are you talking about?
Yeah, right, exactly. I'm just curious.
Well, this actually, this past one, we projected 3.7 and it was 3.9. So I didn't say that in the presentation because next year, you know, we're saying 4.4 and the PISC could be 2. So I don't want to tell my opponent on that. But in your folders, actually, there's historical tables that we do every year for the members of the board. In fact, there's one that specifically addresses that issue. So it's the set of papers that has the binder clip on it.
Oh, yes, okay.
So you'll see, I think it's the third table, maybe? Yeah. So the third table, it's blue and yellow. The PIOC projection compared to the actual PIOC.
I'm sorry, Andrew, what page did you say?
It's not page number, but it's the third. It's the third one. There. It's got a yellow column on the side.
Gotcha.
So those are it's comparing what the PIOC projection was to the actual PIOC, and so, you know, you can see the years where we're off and the years that we are on. So we go both ways in terms of sometimes we're overestimate or underestimate. So over the course of the time, the average percentage point difference was just 0.1, and actually the median this year was 0.1. So, but it, as you can see from the history of it, that we're wrong more often than not.
Okay.
So,
And so 3 out of the last 5 years, the projection, the actual PIOC was lower than the projection, right?
No, I think the other way around.
Oh, I'm sorry, I had it the other way around.
the PIAC was actually higher than the projection.
Yes, but that's what I meant to say.
And that's actually for the last 8, yeah,
Right.
last 8 years. I mean, some were much, like this year was 0.2 percentage points, in 2017, 0.1. So yeah, it will vary, but over time, I guess, you take the projections and they're close.
Like I said, I have a lot to say, so I'll let others.
Of course, we can come back.
Just, there's a lot of different tables in there. We do these annually, so I will send digital versions of those today out to you folks, so you can have them on your computers as well. But I didn't want to send another email with more stuff yesterday.
No, these are very helpful. Alex, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Can you remind us what the commensurates were last year? I believe these are lower than what came up last year. And I have one other question, which is
Okay,
just the, I'll get to.
Yeah, these are lower because the price index is lower. Give me 1 second.
Alex, you want to look at the big chart? It's got last year's commensurates in there.
What is it about? What was your next question, Alex? Why we pulled it up?
Yeah, regarding insurance, if you were to go back over time, I'm curious, what is the relative share of insurance, let's say 5 years ago compared to today?
Yeah, that's a good question. It is rising, the share of the expense. I'd have to go back and take a look to see what that was. I could tell you what it was last year and what it is this year. So the commensurates last year, because we had a higher price index, which was, I think, is it 8%? 8.1%. So the commensurates last year, where the net revenue one was 6% and 11.5%. The CPI and adjusted NOI commensurate adjustment, which would include inflation on the NOI, was actually 8.5% and 16%. And then the traditional was 5.3% and 6.6%. Actually, it's more comparative to use the vacancy ones from last year. I should change that. So the net revenue was 5.75% and 11, and the CPI adjusted NOI was 8.25 and 15.75. So, and it's all driven by the price index. So it makes sense. But if you look at the share of insurance costs, and we could take a look at this over a period of time for you. Last year, the insurance accounted for 7% of the overall price index. This year, I think it's 7.2%.
And just
This
so,
year, it was, 7.2%. So it's been creeping up over the, and how the price index works, there's expenditure study that you do that there's a base of what the percentages are, which we've done. And we change those bases every year by the I&E and how that's, so we adjust the weights every year. But also is factored in the cost, the change in cost or price of that component from year to year. So insurance has been going up significantly for the last 10, 12 years, that's going to even have an impact on it. So as that cost keeps rising, it would have an impact on the weight as well. So that's why last year we had a 12% increase roughly in insurance. Now it's 21. Next year, PIC is going to see even that weight go a little higher because of the change was so big this year.
So can I ask a sort of a methodological question on
No, you may
exactly that
not.
point?
I
may
don't.
not.
I don't talk about that.
I get the year-to-year changes on an individual
Mm-hmm.
item. You get the price of utilities, you get the price of paint, whatever. But to get the share of the overall costs, you have to have an actual cost model to compare it to,
Right,
right?
right. So-
how do you go from the individual items to that sort of,
Right. So
project
what we
cost?
started doing in 2015, I believe, something like that. There was an expenditure study done back in the 80s, and that set the ratios, the weights, for not only the components but the items. And then the methodology was depending on the change in cost or price, because it's a mixture of both. If that particular component or price was higher in a particular year than the overall price index, it would get a little more weight in the next price index. And that was sort of the old traditional method. But we realized that we can now actually go to the I&E report and take those weights and figure out what the expense are for owners. Were they dramatically different? Not so much, but it does afford us to update. The biggest, I think, was fuel costs changed the most. I think when we made that change, fuel used to take 14 or 15%. And then on top of that, we also do periodic item weighting. So we get the cost components from the I&E, but then we'll go back and we'll check, are we doing the items correctly? And since 2015, I think taxes never have to be updated because we get actual tax costs. But I think we've touched 5 different items, weights, which we've changed. And fuel we did twice. So we periodically go back and we check the item weights as well. It will still, and it will equal to that component weight we grabbed from the I&E, but we shift items. The biggest notice, like why we did fuel, for example, is the law required that owners get rid of number 6 fuel oil. So that's why we started, because we didn't collect that anymore. And then, and now they have to transition out of number 4 by 2030. So we'll probably do another, then we're only left with number 2. But then also the change, not only within the type of fuel oil being done, but people switching to natural gas. So natural gas has more weight in that fuel, quite a bit more now than it used to. So we'll go back and we'll do where we think we have to look and update the actual item weights as well. We go back and we include that as, bless you, the part of the survey that we send out, the owner survey. So we ask for that. But the only way you get to that is you need prices from 1 year and prices, total cost from 1 year to total cost this year. That's the only way you can set those items.
Right. I mean, maybe I'm just not fully, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I'm not sure I understand. You're saying you go back to the I&E and take the components from that?
The component weights.
Right.
Right.
How do you get to those component weights?
Well, the component weights are done through the I&E. So we know how expenses
Using the
are spent in the INE.
Using the
Right.
RPIE data,
So we use the RPIE
which may
data.
or may not be, right? I mean, there's a big difference between the RPIE data and the INE and this data, right?
It's so many units, though, that's
You think in
collecting.
aggregate?
We're confident in those weights.
Okay.
More
And
so
is it
than,
adjusted or unadjusted? Or are you only looking?
no, it's just whatever they're,
Whatever it
whatever
comes out.
reporting, because this reports the whole city. We don't adjust, we don't adjust those weights in any way.
Can I just make a
Sure, on this, and then
just a
Rob.
quick request? I know you're going to ask your question, Rob. Just a quick request. Similar to how we got the memo about the INE methodology, or the INE memo that had some of the other methodologies about the audit and why it is that you do the adjustment you do. Would it be possible to get a memo on this exact issue? Because I think it would be helpful to know.
No, I think we had actually made a request prior to today for some additional breakdown.
Okay.
There,
You know.
there is a memo, which I'll start with sending that first. When we made the switch, the entire methodology of what we do is in there. So let me send that off to you folks. And it's on our website for anyone who's watching. It is in our research section. So our entire methodology of how we and why we made the change and why it's all there. There's a whole memo. It's 675-page memo, but no, it's like I don't know,
Can't wait.
8-page memo or something like that.
And there will be a quiz. Rob?
Right. I just want to, I had just mentioned that we had made a request for some additional documentation. I just want to get out there that we had also requested for the commensurate rent adjustment calculation to be produced from the PIAC data focused solely on the pre-74 buildings. And in that analysis, if we could have it broken down by, I'm going to use 6 regions because it's Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, Staten Island, Core Manhattan, and regular Manhattan, and Upper Manhattan. If we can get that data, I think that'll go a long way.
Just, Andrew, I know you mentioned that before as well. I think we can do some of that, right? But not the core Manhattan versus upper Manhattan might be a little bit difficult for some of the data.
We got the request. I'm not going to commit to what we can and cannot do. From reading it one time, yes, I think we can do some of it. It gets trickier when we do certainly try to tease out core. Just what will be impacted are 2 things. The actual, if you do a pre-74 commensurates, part of the commensurate formula is using the cost to income ratios. And we get those from the INE. So those will change. For pre-74, it's different than it is for all apartments. So that's the one thing will change when we redo the commensurates. But the other part that within the price index itself, the item prices they don't necessarily change. We can change them and be specific for taxes because we can tease out borough taxes from all the taxes that we get. I think we can tease out insurance, but everything else, all those prices aren't different any places. Like we don't get pricing for painters that are just in the Bronx, right? So we don't do it that way. The price index isn't designed to do that. We just happen to have cost data that we can tease out. So that will have impacts on
Right,
things.
but I guess my point is that insurance in different areas of the city is definitely different. And obviously taxes are.
Yeah, and I definitely taxes.
Yes.
Insurance, before I look at it, I don't want to comment. I believe you're right, but so we those things can change, but the other price items, what those prices are, will be those prices. So with that said, having a cost to income ratio that may change will have an impact on producing commensurates. We also have to have enough data to break it down by that amount to feel confident to report it. So there's some things going on there so I don't want to, commit to saying that we can do everything that you requested, but I certainly think we can do.
Why not?
Great. Adon?
So while we're staying on the topic of insurance, so would it be possible to get, and maybe it's in this massive, paperwork with all the different charts, but would it be possible to see historically what the share of insurance has been through for the last 20 years?
Yeah, that's what,
That's what-
Alex
oh,
had
that's exactly what
requested
you're-
that. So we can go back a long way.
Okay.
We can go back all the way. We can go back to the beginning of time.
Got it.
Yeah.
Although certainly back to at least when the methodology changed, right?
Right.
I mean, that seems
Oh,
like
we
the
could go,
relevant-
yeah, maybe we should do that. At least go back to the methodology change, and then, yeah, we could go
Right.
further. So, okay.
And so, just to also be clear though, it's 7.2%. It's the lowest weighted. And I'd be curious to see if it's always been the lowest weighted or not. But
Yeah, it's the lowest weighted. Since the change, it's been the lowest weighted. There was an eighth component that we don't like to talk about. The eighth component, when we made the switch from the old methodology to the new, there were 8 components in the price index. We had to get to match the 7 components in the RPIE data that we do. So what we did was we combined maintenance costs with replacement costs. We used to call it replacement costs. That had the lowest weight. That had like less than 1% of impact. That's like buying the paint, the buckets, which has still very little weight. It's the same weight, we just combined it basically into the maintenance component, which is what the RPIE filing does. That's where they ask for those expenses. So they're matching the same type of things that are asked on the RPI. But the next one after that was insurance. So yeah, so traditionally insurance has been the lowest weighted component.
Gotcha. Okay. So switching gears a little bit, I guess, to fuel, I just wanted to touch on something because I noticed that the CPC presentation described like there was an 85% increase in fuel, and it was the standalone figure that was massive. But I see that based off of this report, fuel is actually down 7.1%. And so is the CPC report covered 21, 22, but this covers 23, right?
This is March, it's April of 23 to March
20.
of 2024.
Right.
It's as recent as we can do it. So
Right.
yes, it's a different time period.
Said in that presentation not to trust those numbers.
The fuel numbers, he said, don't, yeah.
Well,
It's reported, yeah, I don't know, but it's reported, but that's, I don't know if the comparison, the pricing is exactly, well, I shouldn't say, it's not the same, in that those are affordable housing that are collected from, the owners of those buildings in that portfolio, and they're going to be different. Like, for example, I noticed their maintenance went up 1%. Here we see it rising, more than that. You would think I know these numbers.
3.5%.
yeah.
3.5%, thank you. So we're saying the change in cost or price in maintenance, it would be actually, it's maintenance is all price. We're saying those are what the prices increased versus they're saying that that's what owners in maintenance, they actually spent on maintenance went up 1%. So it's cost, what they actually spent. So we're saying that we found that prices actually rose this much, but theirs only went up. The actual amount they spent on maintenance only went up 1%. So you can take that however you want to take it. Are they doing all the maintenance as they should? Have they pulled back on maintenance because they don't have the money to run other? There's a lot of different ways you can look at that. But it's one reported cost in one set of buildings versus we're measuring a price change. So it is different.
But the fuel cost wouldn't change in affordable housing as opposed to.
No, not necessarily, but we try to get to cost in that we measure weather. So not only just the price, but we include like whether it's a warmer year compared to a normal year or the previous year. So we do take into account of weather. So, if costs to ride, went up 5%, but if it's a, significantly warmer winter, consumption went down. So where you fall out on how much your costs go up in heating, falls in there. Comparing it to that portfolio, that is specific. That portfolio doesn't really have tax costs as well. So
That's
I'd
something
be
else.
cautioned doing the two.
Yeah, it's interesting, unsurprisingly, that climate change winds up driving down fuel costs for owners. But anyways, Shocking here.
And I'm sure, utilities will go up, right? Because you can have more air
Yeah,
conditioning.
but
Yeah,
it's funny you
yeah.
should mention that though, because the utility cost to tenants, the electric particularly went up at a higher clip over the last 2 years than it did for the owners, which again, they're still operating in fuel. So I get part of that, but still. My question about the tax, since you brought it up, Andrew. Are we to assume that the tax abatement and exemption decrease is mostly related to the fact that 421A sunset and now they're working on a new iteration, and the J51 program, I don't know, and maybe Rob, I don't know, but there was legislation from last year, but I think that there was some snag about the application of it. Right.
So we know the majority of exemptions and abatements come from those programs. So I think it's safe to say that those buildings coming out are actually adding to the overall tax roll. So their taxes are higher because they're no longer getting those benefits. I think it's safe to say that because we know the majority of those are coming from those programs. So, yes.
Can we just stick on taxes for 1 second? I want to make sure I understand the discussion of the tax rate on page 6. You say that last year's average annual tax class 2 rate increased by almost 2%, 1.92%. You say that that's the second consecutive year of increase, and the largest annual increase since 2010. And that's I want to understand the sort of balance of assessment in that, and what it tells us, or if it can tell us anything about valuation and what the tax authorities are seeing in the valuation in the portfolio. So we have 2 years in a row, it seems as though tax assessments, which is to say valuation, is increasing, right?
Correct. So, not being a tax expert completely, and maybe another board member can address this a little better than I can, but generally, I think generally if assessments are increasing at a slower pace or they decline, the way they assess finance sets the value of a building. A multifamily building takes in the income and expense of that building. And I don't know what else is included in that formula, but assessed values aren't market value. I can tell you that much. So, I'm not sure there's a clear cut. I don't know if you can simply say that the values of buildings gone down because the assessed values are lower, or like in Manhattan decreased. That very well could be the case. It's sort of measuring a little bit two different things. And I don't want to jump into a place that I don't know enough about. But I think in general, during times of, recession or whatever, we tend to see assessed values either rising at a smaller rate or declining in some years. But not always. So at the end of the day, I don't know. I'm not sure I can commit to saying that you can totally make that correlate.
Just great. Thank you. Other questions, comments? Please, Adon.
So I've mentioned this, I think, each of the last 2 years, and I will continue to say it until hopefully something can change. I find these commensurate projections really problematic for a series of reasons. I think one, we're trying to project for a constant NOI, which is not our job as a board. And I think that given the issues with not fully understanding what debt service looks like and things of that nature, I think trying to keep owners' profit, or let's just say the NOI to keep copacetic here, constant, I think that's a problem. And I think to do that without having an equal sort of calculation in order to project for what rental adjustment would be necessary to keep rent stabilized tenants not rent burden is really problematic. And I don't think that it's acceptable, frankly, to not have at a bare minimum that sort of side-by-side comparison. And I think if we were to actually see what that downward adjustment would look like, it would turn a lot of heads, because I would assume that it would potentially be a pretty large downward adjustment. And because I get that you've included a lot of the disclaimers in the report, and I appreciate that. I do notice that there's been a difference over time, and I genuinely do. But folks, the public sometimes, as well as the media, don't actually care about the disclaimer. They run with it, and then it winds up shaping the discourse in a way that I don't think is healthy for this process. And so I'm stating my objection, and I guess I'm asking additionally, what happened with that plan to try and get a tenant survey created? Because I think these projections, considering the fact that they're inaccurate many times, it really doesn't do what it's supposed to be doing. And if we're going to continue to use it, then at a bare minimum, we need to have something on the reciprocated end, on the opposite side.
Just one thing about the projection. The projection's only used in the commensurate formula. It's not used in the other two. It's those other two are designed to keep that NOI constant from year to year based on just the price index. So what the rise in owner price or / cost for that 12-month period. So that those two formulas don't use the projection. So so that's what I would say about the projection. Excuse me?
The survey.
Oh, so we did put effort into thinking about sort of an equivalent index. If it's similar to the owner, there would have to be, there would have to be an expenditure study to figure out the different types of costs that the tenants have. It's not simply doing necessarily a survey, because you have to get a base of what people spend on. So we'd have to do that. What we've been trying to do is to take the CPI, professionals at, getting prices and things like that, and try to get to the rise in expenses for tenants. And so this, for example, this year in the INA, we took out the idea of the cost of the housing. We looked at everything else separately, the rise in that. We've had some thoughts, or maybe, well, how can we get to rent stabilized tenants and their rise in, their cost for housing for just rent stabilized, and combining that with the CPI. So we're trying to figure out a metric that maybe we can get to that. I'm not sure if we've gotten to the point of how we then can put that into it sounds like you're asking for a similar commensurates that sort of show what one or two should do if you take into these different things that are going on. So we haven't gotten that far, but we did put effort and time into trying to think about that, with the idea that there's other folks collecting data that would be better than anything that we could collect. So we have put some thought. We haven't gotten there yet. I mean, we'll still continue to put effort into it, but we haven't gotten there yet. So,
Andrew, I'd just say on that, it might be helpful at some point soon. I mean, I know it's been the height of the season, to maybe pull together just a sort of description of what you've been thinking so far, and we can get feedback on that. That might be helpful. Okay. I mean, not obviously necessarily to play into the timing given where we are in our process, but I think trying to resolve some of this, while we're all kind of together and looking at this, I think would be helpful. And it sounds like there's some tricky methodological questions in there, but I appreciate you and the staff looking at it, and it might be helpful to get some feedback, at least at where you are. Rob, and then Alex.
And by the way, and we're not going to go at it here on this, But the disclaimer does go both ways, you know, based on the numbers. You know, and the point of the board doing that is to say that it's not perfect and that this is just their analysis of whatever the data is.
Yeah.
But if we want, you and I can have a separate discussion about rent burden tenants and programs and things that are out there to help these individuals who are in fact rent burden. And I mean, that's a whole other discussion for another day, which is not part of what we're doing today.
Appreciate it.
Just as a quick response to that, I do think it's a little different when for the last however many years this has been going on, where we get these projections and folks run with those projections as gospel sometimes, and to not even have any sort of calculation acknowledging the rent burden on the opposite end to see what downward adjustment would have been necessary to prevent that. I think the optics of that look bad. I think it winds up coming across as not operating in good faith, and I don't think it's the same. I don't think it's the same.
It does go both ways.
And considering the fact that 98% of the time there's an upwards rental adjustment, despite the fact that some of the numbers and some of the data shouldn't necessarily yield that, I think that it's not apples to apples. It's different.
And once again, there are programs out there to help those who are rent burdened. It's there. The money is there. But there aren't necessarily the programs out there to help there aren't adjustments on tax increases. There aren't adjustments on insurance increases. That stuff's not there.
We've already seen from last year and partially this year that the programs that are designed to help landlords, rent stabilize landlords, they don't take advantage of those. And as we talked about last week with CPC, despite the fact that they were trying to push this narrative that a rental adjustment is the only way out of this problem in terms of whatever costs and expenses and distress that landlords are dealing with, is not true. It's just not true. And so the fact that we can try to sit here and go over this again and again and again about how these increases need to be put on the backs of the tenants rather than deal with all of the things that you just mentioned in terms of the other outside programs to help folks who need it, it's problematic.
Thank you. Alex?
Quick question, Andrew. Regarding the commensurates, implicitly it assumes that these properties are 100% rent stabilized and with no non-rental income, commercial income. Is that correct? Because it's assuming that these buildings are entirely subject to rent regulation, rent stabilization. So in other words, if a building was partially rent stabilized, some of the units the rents could go up higher, which would offset the amount that the rent stabilized units would need to go up to preserve the NOI at unchanged.
Yes. The NOI, though, for a particular unit, you could look at it that way too, though. If it's a stabilized unit, to maintain that NOI for that particular unit. Now, the free market is subject to not only increases, but also in times when the market goes down, decreases, like the pandemic. So those can contribute, like in last year's I&E, we saw a huge drop in core Manhattan because of the pandemic, and that usually is a recessional thing too. But it also can add income when rents are like we are currently, right? So, but you can also, because the unit is stabilized and is not subject to the market, you can look at them at using this commensurate for individual stabilized units, even though there's other units in the building. And that's how we've kind of always, even with deregulation, the commensurates have worked that way. And I think, where there was a time where the commensurates were where the buildings contained 100% stabilized. But there are other factors now that you can consider that you don't just, to maintain NOI, that there's free market units in some of these buildings, right? There's other, so that's why I think our language about using these formulas is how you want to use these formulas. And there's all this other data that you can take a look at. And even the more traditional metrics that we've always included about a tenant affordability are still there, and we still, those are obviously still there and still reported, and those could, you could take a look at those metrics and say, X percent of tenants are rent burdened, and then there's severely rent burdened tenants, and you can take that and factor it in to say, okay, well, here are the commensurates. What am I then going to do with this data that talks about affordability? How can I factor that in? And how you sort of weigh everything. And so I think since deregulation, so it's a yes/no answer to your question. You can apply this commensurate to individual stabilized units to maintain that unit's NOI, but also realizing that there's free market units out there that are in that building, and that impacts the total income they get. So I hope I didn't sound too convoluted with that.
And also on that, I would just point out again, on that first chart of the large chart that Andrew circulated, and this goes to the conversation Robin, you and Adon were having, I just think as a historical matter, without saying where we are this year, but just as a historical matter, if you chart all of the commensurates against the preliminary and final guidelines, you'll see that the board for many years has factored in other considerations in reaching the final numbers. Other questions or comments? Andrew, thank you, and thank the staff for this hard work.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Thank you. Terrific. Okay, great. Next, I will introduce Brian Hoberman, the Rent Guideline Board's co-research director, who will be presenting the 2024 Mortgage Survey Report.
Good morning. Let me just set up the mortgage survey. Good morning.
Morning, Brian.
Since the 1980s, the Rent Guidelines Board has conducted a mortgage survey, which highlights the changes in the New York City multifamily lending market over the prior year. The survey, which reports data solely for buildings containing rent-stabilized units, asks lenders questions about financing, underwriting criteria, and other lending-related issues. In addition to the survey analysis, the report examines the sales of buildings containing rent-stabilized units by volume and price. The Rent Guidelines Board each winter surveys institutions that offer loans for multiple dwelling buildings in the city that contain stabilized units. The survey is updated each year to include only those institutions that continue to offer new and refinance mortgages. 8 lenders completed the survey this year, 2 fewer than last year. One of those lenders who did not complete the survey this year, but did last year, reported they had no new lending. After 2 additional rate hikes by the Federal Reserve over the past year, average interest rates for new multifamily mortgages rose to 7%, 98 basis points or 16% higher than a year earlier. The moving 5-year average interest rate was 4.94%, up from 4.47% last year. This slide shows average interest rates charged for new mortgages since 1981. Interest rates were in the double digits throughout the 80s and early 1990s, but fell to a record low 3 years ago. This year, interest rates rose to 7%, the highest average interest rate since 2002. Some lenders charge a separate upfront fee called points as a direct cost to borrowers. The average service fee charged on new loans by lenders rose to 0.37 points, up from last year's 0.29. Among survey respondents, points range between 0 and 1.1, with 3 surveyed lenders charging no points on new loans. This graph shows the average points charged for new mortgages since 1981. Average points reported in the survey have remained around or below 1 point for over 25 years, and this year the average points charged was 0.37. The average volume of new mortgage originations in our survey of buildings with stabilized units fell from the prior year, from 72 last year to 31 this year. The average number of refinance loans also declined from 34 last year to 20 this year. Among surveyed institutions, the typical maximum loan-to-value ratio, which is the maximum amount respondents were willing to lend based on a building's value, ranged from 60 to 85%. This year's average of 71.8% decreased 0.7 percentage points from last year's 72.5%. Another important lending criterion is the debt service coverage ratio, DSCR, which is net operating income divided by the debt service. It reflects an owner's ability to cover mortgage payments using its NOI. The higher the DSCR, the less money a lender is willing to loan given constant net income. The average minimum DSCR of 1.26 was minimally changed from last year's average of 1.25. Overall, DSCR at institutions ranged between 1.15 and 1.50. This graph illustrates the lender's standards for maximum loan-to-value ratios since 1996. This year, the LTV ratio decreased from 72.5 to 71.8% this year. The number of lenders reporting that they had non-performing loans among their portfolio of buildings with stabilized units rose from 4 lenders last year to 6 this year, with lenders on average reported that about 1.2% of their portfolios were non-performing, up from 0.5% last year. In addition, 3 lenders reported foreclosures this year compared to none last year. Of those lenders reporting foreclosures, they represent about 0.2% of their portfolios. The average size of buildings varied widely among lenders in our survey. 3 lenders reported a typical building in their portfolio contains 100 or more units. 2 lenders reported 50 to 99 units. 1 lender reported building average with fewer than 11 units. Another lender reported 11 to 19 units. And a final lender reported a typical building is 20 to 49 units. This graph shows average vacancy collection losses since 1996. Average VNC losses declined slightly, falling from 3.4% last year to 3.31% this year. Note, however, that the change in VNC losses since last year was impacted by 1 lender who reported comparatively large losses in last year's survey but did not complete the survey this year. Next, we'll move on to the longitudinal analysis, which examines findings among institutions that responded to our survey both last year and this year. Among the 8 respondents that completed the survey this year, all also responded last year. The 8 lenders that make up the longitudinal group and their responses from both years are compared in this section to illustrate changes between the 2 years. Similar to the main survey analysis, the longitudinal group saw interest rates rise. As of March 2024, interest rates averaged 7%, up from 6.1% a year earlier. Among the longitudinal group, average points offered by lenders also rose from 0.35 last year to 0.37 this year. The maximum average loan-to-value ratio declined among the longitudinal group, falling from 72.5% last year to 71.8% this year. The average debt service ratio rose from 1.24 to 1.26 this year. And unlike the main mortgage survey analysis, VNC losses among the longitudinal group increased to 3.31 this year from 3% last year. Next, we'll move on to an analysis of sales of buildings that contain rent-stabilized units. In 2023, 583 buildings containing stabilized units were sold in the city, a 34% decline from the prior year. Among buildings with 6 to 10 units, sales volume in 2023 fell 38% from the prior year. Among 11 to 19 unit buildings, sales fell 21%. Among 20 to 99 unit buildings, sales volume decreased 33%. And among the largest buildings with 100 or more units, sales volume citywide fell from 27 buildings last 2022 to 11 buildings in 2023. Examining sales volume around the city, every borough saw sales fall. Sales fell the most in Brooklyn, down 48%, followed by the Bronx, down 44%, Queens, down 29%, and Manhattan, down 18%, and citywide sales volume fell by 34%. And as in prior years, Staten Island is not included in this analysis because there are too few sales of buildings containing stabilized units to meaningfully measure change from year to year. This graph illustrates that over the 2-decade period for which we have data, citywide sales were at their peak in 2005 with 1,816 buildings sold, and sales reached their lowest point in 2020 with 470 buildings sold. Sales then rose for 2 years and fell again in 2023 to 583 buildings sold. Now we'll shift to an analysis of sales prices of buildings containing stabilized units. Examining sales for all sizes of buildings, the median citywide sales price in 2023 was $3.4 million. The highest median sales price was in Manhattan at $6.5 million, followed by the Bronx at $4.4 million, Brooklyn $2 million, and Queens $1.8 million. Looking at sales prices by building size, among the smallest buildings with 6 to 10 residential units, the median sales price citywide was $1.7 million. Among 11 to 19 unit buildings, the median price was $3.9 million. Buildings with 20 to 99 units sold for a median price of $6.2 million. And among the largest buildings with 100 or more units, too few buildings were sold to accurately report building prices. Looking at average sales price per residential unit in buildings containing stabilized units, in 2023, the average sales price per unit citywide was $343,217, an inflation-adjusted decrease of 24.3% from the prior year. Around the city, average sales price per unit was highest in Manhattan at $484,474, down 26.6%, followed by Brooklyn at $259,505, down 26.5%. The Bronx at $208,136, down 21.2%, and Queens at $180,491, down 48.2%. Examining building sales by the proportion of stabilized units in a building, of the 583 buildings containing stabilized units sold this year, 395 buildings contained at least 50% stabilized units and sold for a median price of $2,613,000. 313 buildings with 80% or more stabilized units sold for a median price of $2,550,000, and 174 100% stabilized buildings sold for a median price of $1,750,000. Looking at the change in average sales price per unit, among buildings with at least 50% stabilized units, the average sales price was $240,174, a 42.4% inflation-adjusted decline from the prior year. Among 80% plus stabilized buildings, the average price was $237,857, a 38.3% decline. And among 100% stabilized buildings, the average price per unit was $270,492, an inflation-adjusted decline of 38.2% from the prior year. Considering building sales based on whether they were constructed before 1974 or after 1973, 36 buildings, or 6%, were built post-73, and their median sales price was $5,377,500. On a per unit basis, post-73 buildings sold for an average of $621,754 per unit, an inflation-adjusted 21.6% decline from the prior year. The remaining 547 buildings were built pre-47 and sold for a median price of $3,250,000. Among those buildings, a unit sold for an average of $292,452, down an inflation-adjusted 19.4% from the prior year. This graph shows average sales price per residential unit citywide for all buildings containing rent-stabilized units since 2003, adjusted for inflation. In 2023, while the average sales price of about $343,000 declined from the prior year, it was still more than 2.5 times the inflation-adjusted price of 2 decades earlier, when it was about $135,000 in 2003. All the precise figures illustrated in this graph can be found in the report in Appendix 10, which also breaks them down each year by borough. So, to sum up this year's mortgage survey report, due to additional rate hikes by the Federal Reserve over the last 12 months, average interest rates increased this year. In addition, maximum loan-to-value ratios decreased. Further, average points charged rose, but VNC losses declined among the surveyed lenders. Finally, the number of buildings containing stabilized units sold decreased, as did the average per unit sales price. Thank you. I will now take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Brian. If you mind, sorry.
Yes.
Thank you. Christina?
Yeah, I have a few questions about the, when the sales or the price is broken down by unit, is that for what the rent stabilized units are or for all units in that building?
It's for all units. It's the average or the median? Average, yeah.
Of all, and then further breaking it down when it's, 50% rent stabilized, 80%, is there any balancing of the fact that maybe one of those units is 10 units total and the other is, just the sizing of the units? Because if it's 50% of 10 units versus 80% of 200 units, like all of the, it's hard to, I want to see if, I'm trying to understand how to compare and use these numbers, if at all.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's, I'm not sure if we can break it down. We'll have to take a look
Okay,
because there may be too few buildings, like in certain categories.
okay. That's all.
Other questions?
I just have a comment. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that sales have been declining, but interest rates are also extremely high for the most recent historic period. I would hesitate anyone from jumping to just values are falling, that conclusion. Interest rates are high. It's making borrowing really expensive. That doesn't necessarily mean value is falling.
Thank you. Brian, let me ask a methodological question. So when we ask our survey respondents about underwriting, do we ask about issues like what they project in terms of rent increases and expense increases? I know when we had M&T last year, they came and testified about their current underwriting standards in terms of their assumptions in the current market, and I'm curious whether we ask those questions.
Those specific questions we don't ask, but that's something we could look into adding for next year.
Okay, I think I'd be curious about that. Thank you.
So while we're on that topic, actually, the underwriting, so it stated in the report that 5 lenders had said that they considered good building maintenance as part of the underwriting process. Is there a way to find out how they measure that? And yeah, I'll just start with there. Is there a way to find out how they actually measure that component?
We don't ask them that. I mean, generally, that's been the same year after year. They always say maintenance is very important, but in terms of specifics, we don't ask them that. I think, in terms of adding questions, I think, we already have a difficulty getting lenders to respond to our survey. We try not to necessarily ask too many specific questions, so we can look into that.
I guess I would just try to understand like how much weight and how important that aspect of this equation is when deciding to, provide the loan, which is why I'm asking. But to the extent that we could find that out, I think that would be helpful.
Alex, and then Doug?
Yeah. Do we know how value is calculated in terms of when you look at loan-to-value ratio? Is it applying a cap rate or is it some other method? And if it is cap rate, do we have information on what the cap rate is and how it's changed?
Yeah, I have to look into that. I don't think we asked them specifically how they report that.
I think we could, even if they're not using cap rates, we can find the cap rates for rent stabilized. That's published data. Yeah. My understanding is cap rates are going up.
Yeah, I wonder, I know this year you did a supplemental owner mortgage survey. And I wonder if I could ask a question about the relationship between, so you have the lender data and now we have owner data.
I'm sorry, I don't have a copy of that memo.
Oh, okay.
Oh, no, do I? Yes, I do. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead. I'm sorry, which question?
It's in the folders, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, which part of the memo were you asking about?
The owner mortgage survey,
Yes.
the short memo that, based upon data you collected from, I don't know.
Yeah, as part of the PIOC
like
survey.
Yeah, 600 or so?
617, yeah.
Yeah, owners, which had slightly different data, which I thought was interesting. Like, if I looked at the loan to value, it seemed a little lower.
So this is based on information for these particular
Right.
respondents, and it's not necessarily for this year that. I
Well,
mean,
it's their current, I assume it's their current.
Right, it's not, it's,
Whatever debt they may have
it would be
today.
different than what a lender would,
Right. So that's more like-
requirements
So
for
the
current
lender is
year.
looking at point in time as.
Yes.
At their current lending standards.
right,
And the owner data is reflecting the current condition of
right.
the
and-
underlying debt on that building.
Yeah, I mean, some of these loans were, opened years
Years
ago.
ago.
Yeah.
Okay, no, that's interesting. Maybe something to talk about or dig into as we think about, the underlying debt on a building. It's a different,
I mean, we do have, well, one thing that projects, it doesn't go back in time, but we have on the last page, the projections for when the balloon payment is due. And,
right,
Yeah, but
right.
Don?
So I have a question, and for this one, I genuinely maybe missed something in the report. So how much of the rent-stabilized stock as a whole do these institutions cover? And where can I find that data?
I'm sorry, the lenders?
Yeah, in terms of lending out to
Well, let me see. There were five, according to our analysis of sales of buildings, there were 583 buildings.
But Don, I
and-
think you mean in terms of the mortgage survey.
Right, I'm just
Yeah.
comparing that.
yes.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the number of loans, we have,
And I wasn't being facetious, I
if you look on
generally.
page, if you have to total up the number of loans in each of these portfolios. Offhand, I don't know what it is, but
Okay.
if you total that up and you compare that to the number of building sales, that'll give you an idea what proportion this represents.
Okay. What, could I trouble you to help me with that math?
Well, if you have a calculator,
All right.
or you want me to do it now, I can do
No,
that.
no, no, if you give me the numbers, I could.
It's on page 13, the new volume column.
Sure.
It gives you the average, but I don't have the sum.
Yeah. All right, so-
Always good to do math in the middle of a meeting.
I know, right?
We can
Especially as a
follow up.
lawyer, we're good at that, right?
Other questions? Great, Brian, thank you very much.
I'm sorry, I
Courtney,
did have
please,
some other
please.
questions.
Yeah, yeah.
Is it possible to see, sales volume broken down by building size and borough? And is that in there? It could be. I didn't think it was.
Building size and borough sales volume is on page 17.
So, yeah, I actually did the math. So there were a total of 249 loans? Is that what I wrote down? 249, and if you take that, it's 43% of the sales. The timing's maybe a little bit off, but, yeah, so we're, covering, you can look at it, potentially covering 43% of those loans that were made in 2023 from the lenders we served, or the lenders we surveyed made 43% of those loans,
Of new originations.
new originations.
So of the so of the 6 lenders, right, because there's 6 this year instead of
8, right?
No, there's
8.
Oh, I'm sorry, it was just too few in it. Yeah,
Right.
so
So
of
the
the 8,
eight lenders did 249 loans.
Right.
Right? There were 583 building sales.
yep.
So it's roughly 43% of the building sales are represented by these lenders. Right. If the timing is the same, if the timing is the same
'Cause
county.
You get the denominator, because you also know how many buildings that have rent-stabilized apartments in them sold. That's the 500?
Yes, yeah, they have
Okay.
at least one stabilized unit.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. No, no, that's okay.
Yeah, just a sort of obvious upfront question. So you explained why one of the two lenders didn't report this year. Do you know why the other lender didn't?
They had a change in management. They decided not to participate.
Please, Doug.
Do we ask those lenders how many loans that they reviewed but didn't make a loan on? Meaning they kind of rejected the,
No, we don't.
we don't. Maybe something to ask.
I guess on that note, well, how many loans that they'd given out did they actually take back?
Yeah, it's an interesting.
Because that's, was there? I didn't. Yeah, well, not necessarily foreclosures, because there are,
Right, there are other
there are
workouts.
other, right.
Sure, of course.
Just as a final comment, and I'm glad that we're bringing that up. So I think just as a baseline measure, I just want to again reiterate that I don't think that the RGB should be in the business of passing on the after effects of inflation control measures on tenants in the form of rent increases. And I also do want to just state that, you know, in terms of the distress or underperforming portfolios, it was reported in this report that I think 1.2% of the portfolios were not performing and 0.2 were in foreclosure. So it doesn't seem like it's not the picture that CPC was kind of worried about a bit. And then also the average vacancy in collection, because I know CPC spoke to this also, it projected or presented a way lower number at 3.3%, which fell for the second year in a row.
Thank you. Alex?
Yeah, so just want to point something out. This is really more just an observation. So a while back, there was an article in Bloomberg which referred to a survey of rent-stabilized housing sales. And I was interested to see how this study compared to that. I just thought I'd just mention it for the record. So it referred to a survey of a company called Maverick Real Estate Partners, and they found, I think it's over exactly the same time period in 2023, average sale price of $203,000 per unit compared to $343,000. So, and also that showed a decrease in prices of 34% since 2019 versus a 26% controlling for inflation decrease. So all I'm saying is that this data, which I think is probably perhaps more accurate since it's not a survey, shows a substantial decrease, but not as sharp as what some of these private surveys have also found for the same period.
Thank you, Alex.
Sure, it's an article, I'll send it to you.
You could send it to Andrew. We'll send
Yeah,
it.
I think I did send it to you, yeah.
We'll give him more work, it's okay.
He can handle it. All right, Brian, again, thank you, and thank you for all the work on this.
Yes, thank you.
All right, finally, we'll now hear a presentation, and I'm honored to introduce Woody Pascal, Deputy Commissioner for the Office of Rent Administration from the New York State Homes and Community Renewal. Woody, thank you so much for joining us.
All righty, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Woody Pascal. I'm the Deputy Commissioner, at New York State Homes and Community Renewal's Office of Rent Administration, also known as ORA. On behalf of State Housing Commissioner Ruth Ann Visnaskis and everyone at HCR, let me extend our sincere thanks for your continued willingness to serve the people of New York City. But before I begin, please allow me to introduce to you my colleague, April Gray Gutierrez, Principal Attorney and Deputy Bureau Chief of the Property Management Bureau. Chairman Davidson, members of the board, I thank each and every one of you for the opportunity to provide you with an update on recent activities at ORA and for allowing HCR to be part of the process leading to the promulgation of this year's guidelines for rent-regulated apartments. As you all know, our primary mission is to ensure that tenants and owners know what their rights and responsibilities are under the laws of rent regulation. Our expertise has enabled us to support tenants and owners through many crises, and today is no different. My team continues to innovate, learn, and strengthen ORA's ability to serve the public. I'm proud of how we continue to improve the ease and efficiency of our service platforms that includes multi-language translation assistance, providing online access to individual cases and rent records, and more transparent reporting mechanisms. We continue to inform tenants and owners about their rights and responsibilities under rent regulation, and we have experienced management team with all the necessary measures in place to keep ORA running effectively, all while protecting the health and safety of our employees and their families. Some of the things that I would like to highlight for our continued operations is ORA continues to work closely with owner and tenant groups in new municipalities of Newburgh and Kingston that have adopted the Emergency Tenant Protection Act, also known as ETPA, regarding registration requirements and tenant protections. We have continued to work with our partners in government and community-based organizations to attend community forums. Our staff has been working closely with the RGB staff to further clarify reporting of units exempt from rent stabilization due to them reaching 421A market rate threshold exemption levels. ORA continues to provide, on average, several thousand apartment rent histories to tenants each and every month. We continue to process all case types, and we regularly meet with tenants and owners at our local borough rent offices. We continue to work closely with the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, the Department of Buildings, the Department of Finance, the Mayor's Office of Special Enforcement, the New York City Housing Authority, and lastly, we are all very proud of our efforts to increase transparency to the public, which includes monthly case processing data, key metrics, appeal decisions, also known as petitions for administrative review, PAR, and now major capital improvement closed cases with monthly reports. We now have 31 documents, including a lease rider translated into 12 languages, so tenants can better understand their rights. Looking ahead, we pledge to keep building on what we've learned and to adhere to the belief that our work is essential to helping New Yorkers preserve and improve the homes they live in and thus their quality of life. And we're confident that ORA will continue to make a positive contribution, and I want to thank our dedicated employees and the relationships we have with interested parties and stakeholders. Again, on behalf of Commissioner Visnaskis and HCR, I wish you success in your difficult deliberations and offer you continued support and cooperation. Thank you. We'll take questions now.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And again, really appreciate both of you being here. I guess I'll open with one question, and thank you. We had sent a set of questions that we do annually, and I really appreciate you and your staff turning them around. I'm wondering if you could just say a word or two about some questions at the end on owner hardship applications. You note that there were 9 hardship applications filed in 2023, and that the cases can take some time to resolve because there are often tax certiorari proceedings pending or filed. I'm wondering if that's the primary barrier, if you're seeing other barriers, and perhaps what what ORA or DHCR more generally is doing, perhaps to respond to these applications?
I think, excuse me, I think part of it is the tax certiorari. The other thing is that the application is, I believe, about 18 pages long, and owners don't always provide the information up front, so the processing staff has to continually ask for information. And because of the way it works out and the actual calculations, it does take some time. 9 is actually a high number for us. We usually don't get more than 1 or 2 a year, so.
And that leapt out of me from the data last year, and that's why I wanted to ask how you're responding to that increase in requests.
We have accounting staff that looks at those applications.
Thank you. Other questions? Adon, of course. Of course.
Just to follow up on the hardship, so I'm not sure, maybe I'm asking, I don't know how familiar you are with the hardship application, but there's certain qualifications the owners have to meet in order to even file that. Can you summarize some of those benchmarks that they, for example, I know that, at least, I think it's 95% of, of the income is going toward expenses. Isn't that one benchmark, or 90 or 95? And then, and the process the rents can go as maybe be increased as high as 20%? Is that another one? Or, I don't know, if you could just, what are those benchmarks that the owners have to hit? And if not, I can follow up with a question, email or whatever.
We could follow up with that. The actual calculations, no, I couldn't tell you exactly what each of those pieces are.
Thank you.
Thank you both for being here and for providing the answers that we have in front of us to these questions. I have one upfront question I just want to confirm, and then I have a series of other questions. So I saw here, I'm just trying to find the exact page. So the answer to question 21 about MCI increase amounts claimed in the last 5 years is over $1 billion. That's accurate, right? I just want to confirm that number. Yes. Okay. All right. So I guess a few questions I had. In terms of the overcharge cases that DHCR is processing, do you keep track of the number of deregulated units that wind up going back into regulation as a result of the analysis that's done at HCR? No. Okay. I guess I'm also curious because as far as I've ever seen, a tenant can only file an overcharge complaint by the form, but there's no separate form for a deregulation. Like if they're alleging that it was illegally deregulated at a certain point in time. Is there a reason, or could you explain the reason as to why there's no separate mechanism for that? Because conceivably there could be a case, right, where a tenant could want to allege an illegal deregulation of the unit, but for different reasons they may not be able to prove that there was sufficient fraud enough to get an overcharge. So I'm just wondering why it is that there's no separate cause of action essentially for them at the agency.
I think if what they're looking for is something like that, a determination related to the rent, they could file an administrative determination proceeding, which is one option. Off the top of my head, I can't tell you how often any of that actually happens. And, the look-back period is 6 years on an overcharge,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah.
But as part of an administrative determination proceeding, if the question has to do with jurisdiction, the agency will go further than the 6 years because they'll look for the jurisdiction, not the overcharge.
Right. And I guess while I'm sticking on that topic, so I know that the TPU, the Tenant Protection Unit, they deal with a whole lot of things around tenant harassment and things of that nature. Are there any efforts by HCR currently or into the future projected to try and assist tenants with this issue of illegally deregulated units pre-2019? Because I would think it's in the agency's interest, right, as well as the tenant's interest, to try and get a better sense of whether or not their unit or other units have been improperly deregulated.
It hasn't really been brought up as an issue for us. This is the first I've actually heard it as a major concern.
Right, I think, and I can appreciate that. I think that given the fact that you have the choice of forum now, where you can take it to Supreme, you could, file it as a defense in the housing court case, and you also have the ability at the agency. It's just interesting to me because this issue of improper or allegedly improper deregulation is something that affects not only the work that we do here, but also tenants, countless tenants in the city. And do we have a sense of how much money was awarded in overcharge cases in the last year or two? Because I didn't see.
We can get you that number,
Okay.
but probably a couple $1 million.
Okay. And I have some others, but I'll let other folks.
Hey, Woody, how are you? Nice to see you.
Good morning.
I had a question on the MCI, and some of your questions, the answers to some of the questions asked by the staff. The average MCI rent increase per room for 23 was $11.53. That was, the methodology for that is based upon the dollars applied for by owners, which you have as 119 million. You have a certain number of applications filed, then every application obviously is by apartment and by room size. Do you have any breakout of that by the, or a way to measure? I know you do it a little differently, like the way we typically look at things, pre-73, post-74, borough breakdowns, anything like that you have on MCIs? Or could produce?
You do it by borough and by zip code.
Okay, but not by type of building, not by whether it's a, got it. That would be maybe helpful as some measure. I mean, there's all kinds of, obviously, we're not talking about the current conversation, but just interesting to sort of see what that number looks like across boroughs or, is there any way, Andrew, to look to see if there's a data match that we could do between their MCI approvals and your building file? Or that's, I'll leave it at that.
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but we could take a look.
Okay.
I'll just note, as a practitioner representing landlords, we're the landlord reps, I have seen a quicker determination time in overcharges. So I wanted to say that because.
Although I will say, sometimes prompted by a judicial letter.
Yeah.
But it's okay, it works.
I would say this, code has changed, impacted clearly how we process the number of staff that we've had.
Yeah.
Over the last couple of years, we probably hired 150, 100 people, and we're about to start to ramp up again.
That's great.
Probably 50 or 60.
That's great.
Yeah, and I think I've also seen, because there's a choice of forum, tenants can elect to bring their overcharge in the confines of a non-pay. That's probably going to bring your caseload down. I would think tenants have been told, and landlords, I think, I've been telling my clients that they might get a quicker result just due to the sheer volume at DHCR. So that could be another reason why things are kind of evening out, and hopefully, your staff is able to support. Yeah.
But don't let up on the hiring.
Yeah, that's right.
Good. Well, again, thank you so much for being here. I know it takes a lot of time out. And really thank you for how responsive your staff has been. And we've noted a few follow-up questions, and we'll follow up as well.
Thank you.
Really, really appreciate it. Let me ask if the board have any more questions or items for discussion, and welcome, Christina.
Thank you. Thanks.
If not, could I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Second? We are adjourned.
God, you're slow, man. I guess
We'll see you all next week.